The source wall had been cracking for months. Not the dramatic apocalyptic shattering that mortals imagined when cosmic structures failed, but something far more insidious, a slow deterioration that spread through the barrier between existence and oblivion, like frost creeping across glass. The monitors had detected it first, their instruments registering fluctuations in the membrane that separated the known multiverse from the howling chaos beyond. They called emergency councils, drafted contingency protocols, and watched with mounting dread as fractures spiderwebbed across the surface of reality's ultimate boundary. In the spaces between universes, in that churning red expanse called the bleed, something was going wrong. Omega energy hemorrhaged from the wall's wounds, mixing with the dimensional substrate in ways that violated every law of DC's cosmic architecture. The bleed itself began to pulse with irregular rhythms, as if the multiverse had developed an arrhythmia. Waves of distortion rippled outward from the wall, each one carrying interference patterns that made the monitor's equipment scream warnings in languages older than thought. Then the resonance began. It started as a vibration so subtle that even beings who could perceive the quantum foam of space-time nearly missed it. A frequency that shouldn't exist within creation's framework, originating from somewhere outside the 52 known universes. The monitors triangulated its source to a breach point in the wall, where reality had worn so thin that the barrier between what was and what should never be had effectively dissolved. Through that gap, something alien pressed against the boundaries of DC's cosmos. God Key. The energy had a signature completely foreign to the source, to the anti-life equation, to every form of power that fueled DC's pantheons and sustained its cosmic order. It carried the weight of divine destruction, of battles fought on scales that shattered planets, as collateral damage of warriors who pushed their bodies past biological limitations through sheer refusal to accept defeat. When it made contact with the Omega energy bleeding from the wall, the two forces recognized something in each other. Not compatibility, but a mutual intensity that defied conventional physics. The bleed convulsed. Space folded in on itself as the two energies locked together, forming a bridge that spanned the gulf between fundamentally incompatible realities. Somewhere in the Dragon Ball universe, where gods of destruction erased planets on whims and Saiyans achieved transformations that made them rivals to cosmic entities, that bridge found an anchor point. Vegeta had been training alone when the universe reached through the void and seized him. He'd chosen isolation, deliberately pushing his body through exercises that would have killed lesser beings, driving himself toward the perfection that always seemed to hover just beyond his grasp. The Saiyan prince floated in the vacuum of space, surrounded by the debris of asteroids he'd shattered during his warm-up, his aura flickering between blue and violet as he cycled through transformations. Sweat evaporated instantly in the void, and his breath came in controlled bursts. Despite the absence of atmosphere, his body had long since adapted to environments that would make conventional biology an absurd limitation. He never saw the rift open behind him. One moment the cosmos around him followed rules. He understood power systems he'd spent his life mastering. The next reality tore open like wet paper, and something that was absolutely not supposed to touch his universe made contact with his Kai. The sensation was wrong on every level. Not painful, but profoundly incorrect, as if someone had tried to translate his existence into a language that lacked the proper alphabet. Vegeta spun instinct, bringing his guard up, but the dimensional current was already pulling him backward. His Kai flared in automatic defense, purple energy erupting around his body as Ultra Ego activated in response to the threat. But there was nothing to fight, no enemy to destroy, only the hungry mouth of a breach between realities that had found something it could use as a conduit. The Prince of all Saiyans had faced gods, tyrants, and demons. He had pushed past death itself through sheer refusal to accept limitation. But as the rift swallowed him and reality inverted around his struggling form, dragging him across the space between incompatible universes, Vegeta experienced something genuinely novel. For the first time in years, he had absolutely no idea what was happening. The bleed took him. The passage felt like being unmade and reassembled atom by atom. His consciousness struggling to maintain coherence as the fabric of one reality released its grip and another began to impose its rules. Colors that didn't exist in his native universe strobed past his vision. His ki twisted and reformed, adapting to cosmic laws that operated on different fundamental principles. Somewhere far away, he could sense the source wall's fractures widening as his passage forced the breach to expand, could feel the attention of vast and ancient entities turning toward the disturbance he represented. Then the journey ended as abruptly as it had begun, and Vegeta was hurled into a universe that had no idea what was about to hit it. Vegeta crashed into hell. Not the metaphorical kind, not some abstract concept of suffering actual fire and brimstone rendered in industrial metal and rivers of molten rock. The impact carved a trench half a mile long through Apocalypse surface, superheated metal spraying in his wake as his body plowed through foundry complexes and weapons facilities. He came to rest at the bottom of a crater that glowed cherry-red smoke rising from the liquefied ground beneath him. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Then the Saiyan Prince pushed himself upright, purple energy still crackling around his frame in dying surges. His training gi had survived the dimensional transit scorched but intact, and his body showed no signs of the trauma that should have accompanied being dragged across the membrane between realities. He rose to his feet slowly, deliberately taking in his surroundings, with the cold assessment of a warrior who'd fought on 1,000 battlefields. The architecture surrounding him was wrong in ways that had nothing to do with aesthetics. Massive structures of dark metal rose toward a sky that burned crimson, their surfaces crawling with circuits that pulsed with energy signatures he didn't recognize. The air itself tasted of ash and ozone, and something else, a weight of oppression so thick it pressed against his ki like a physical force. In the distance, machinery ground and screamed, processing something that might have been ore or might have been organic matter. It was impossible to tell, and Vegeta found he didn't particularly care. What he cared about was the army forming on the crater's rim. They came in waves, emerging from tunnels and descending on wings that looked like they'd been grafted from dead things. Parademons, though, Vegeta had no name for them, numbered in the hundreds, then thousands, their insectoid forms bristling with weapons that glowed with the same corrupt energy that saturated this world. They made sounds halfway between howls and mechanical screeches, and the synchronized fury of their approach would have broken the morale of any conventional military force. Vegeta smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. The security systems of Apocalypse had classified him automatically, running his power signature through databases that cataloged every threat the planet had ever faced. The analysis took microseconds, and the conclusion was unanimous. Omega-class threat. Eliminate immediately. Authorization for maximum force granted. The first wave hit him like a breaking storm. Energy beams converged from a dozen angles, each one powerful enough to reduce a tank to slag. Parademons dove with claws extended their altered physiology, allowing them to survive impacts that would shatter normal bone. Combat drones materialized from the smoke-firing weapons that bent space itself. It was coordinated, overwhelming the kind of assault that had broken planetary defenses and brought civilizations to their knees. Vegeta raised one hand almost casually and swatted the entire attack aside. The gesture released a shockwave that turned the first 100 parademons into expanding clouds of organic debris. The energy beam scattered like light, hitting a prism redirected into trajectories that sent them careening into Apocalypse's own infrastructure. Explosions blossomed across the Foundry district as redirected fire found fuel reserves and ammunition stockpiles. The combat drones simply ceased to exist, their constituent atoms unable to maintain coherence in the face of Kai that operated on principles their creators had never imagined. More came. They always did. Vegeta moved into them like a storm given form and purpose. His fists connected with bodies that were more machine than flesh. And each impact generated shockwaves that flattened everything in expanding spheres of devastation. He didn't transform beyond his base state, didn't need to. These creatures were insects beneath even the minimal effort required to access Super Saiyan Blue. His movements carried the precision of decades spent perfecting the warrior's art. Each strike calculated to generate maximum destruction with minimum wasted energy. A parademon tried to grapple him from behind. Vegeta caught its arm without looking twisted and used the creature's momentum to hammer it through 3 of its companions. The resulting crater sent cracks racing across what might have been a parade ground, or might have been a mass grave. It was getting hard to tell. The landscape was transforming under his assault, the careful industrial organization of Apocalypse's surface giving way to chaos. Fire pits erupted as underground fuel lines ruptured. Entire sections of the facility network collapsed as support structures failed. The air filled with smoke and falling debris, and through it all, Vegeta advanced, his expression locked in something between contempt and boredom. He'd fought the armies of Frieza, faced the warriors of Universe 11, traded blows with gods of destruction. These mechanical horrors were barely worth his attention. Then, he felt a presence that actually registered on his combat instincts. The Avatar materialized 20 yards away, stepping into existence without the fanfare of a boom tube or the flash of teleportation. It simply was where it hadn't been a moment before, as if reality had retroactively adjusted to include it. Humanoid in the loosest sense, towering to 12 feet, its form composed of something that looked like stone, but moved like living tissue. Eyes that glowed red with power that made the parademon weapons look like children's toys. Omega energy leaked from those eyes in visible streams. And the ground beneath the Avatar's feet simply ceased to exist, unable to maintain structure in proximity to that much concentrated destruction. Vegeta's smile widened. The Avatar studied him in silence, running analysis that went far beyond the crude threat assessment of the automated defenses. This was intelligence ancient vast, and currently very interested in the anomaly that had crashed into its domain. It made no move to attack, showed no sign of aggression beyond its mere presence. The parademons had stopped their assault, held back by some unspoken command, forming a perimeter around the 2 figures who now faced each other across scorched earth. The Saiyan prince cracked his knuckles, a sound that carried across the sudden silence like breaking bone. His Kai began to rise purple flames, starting to lick around his frame as battle excitement finally gave him something worth acknowledging. He could feel the depth of power in the being before him. Layers of strength that suggested this was merely a projection of something far greater. Good. Better than good. Excellent. He hadn't come to this place intentionally, had no idea where he was or how he'd gotten here. But Vegeta had spent his entire life seeking challenges that would push him beyond his limits, hunting for battles that would force him to transcend the boundaries of Saiyan biology. And standing before him now was something that radiated the kind of power that made his warrior's instincts sing with anticipation. The Avatar moved first impossibly fast, for something so massive, one hand extending toward Vegeta's center mass. But the Saiyan prince was already moving his body a blur as he closed the distance fist, driving toward those glowing red eyes with force that would shatter mountains. Their collision sent a shockwave across Apocalypse that registered on New Genesis's instruments as a localized earthquake. Somewhere in the distance, klaxons began to wail. The parademons scattered their programming, recognizing that the battlefield had just escalated beyond their operational parameters. And in his throne room, deep within Apocalypse's core, something that wore Darkseid's face like a mask turned its attention toward the disturbance and found itself genuinely curious for the first time in millennia. The tremor reached New Genesis 3 seconds after the collision, rippling through the dimensional substrate that separated the realm of light from its dark twin. It wasn't the physical shockwave that triggered the alarms. Apocalypse generated those constantly, an endless percussion of war and industry. This was something else, a disturbance that registered on instruments calibrated to measure the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. Highfather felt it in his bones before the mother boxes began to sing their warnings. He stood in the hall of contemplation, a space where the walls were translucent and showed the stars of 1,000 realities simultaneously. The staff in his hand, older than most civilizations, carved from wood that had grown in the first garden before entropy learned to kill, trembled with sympathetic vibrations. Around him, the architecture of New Genesis responded to the disturbance with cascading alerts rendered in harmonics that only divine ears could parse. Something was wrong with the cosmic order, and the wrongness was spreading. The mother boxes confirmed what his instincts already knew. Their chorus reached a crescendo that translated roughly to profound confusion. Dozens of the sentient devices attempting to analyze data that refused to conform to any known parameters. One floated before Highfather, its surface flickering through colors that didn't exist in standard light spectrums, and when it spoke, the sound carried an edge of something the ancient leader of New Genesis had rarely heard from these beings: fear. Energy signature detected on Apocalypse. Classification impossible. Origin external to creation. Threat assessment incalculable. Highfather's expression didn't change, but his grip on the staff tightened. "Show me." The mother box complied, projecting a holographic reconstruction of the battle occurring on the neighboring world. The image quality was poor. The energy saturating the combat zone was interfering with standard observation protocols. But what it showed was clear enough. A humanoid figure, small by new god standards, moving through Darkseid's legions like a force of nature given flesh. The parademons died in waves, their bodies unable to withstand impacts that generated thermal blooms visible from orbit. And then the Avatar's arrival, and the collision that had sent shockwaves through both worlds. But it was the energy signature that held Highfather's attention. The mother box was right. This was nothing that should exist within the framework of DC's cosmos. Not the source which powered the new gods and gave structure to divine hierarchies. Not the anti-life equation which Darkseid had sought across epochs. This was something fundamentally other, carrying frequencies that suggested it originated from a reality operating on completely different universal constants. Around him, more mother boxes gathered, drawn by the anomaly, like curious children approaching something that shouldn't exist. They attempted analysis from multiple angles, trying to interface with the stranger's energy using every protocol in their vast databases. Each attempt failed. When they applied source frequency harmonics to decode the power signature, space itself buckled around the measurement points, creating localized distortions that made observation equipment scream warnings about imminent dimensional collapse. "He's not connected to the source." Metron's voice came from behind, analytical and cold. The new god of knowledge materialized from the ether, his Mobius chair humming with activity as it processed the same data the mother boxes struggled to comprehend. "Nor to any derivative power structure I can identify." His energy operates on principles that predate or postdate our cosmic architecture. Highfather turned to face him. An invader. Possibly, probably. Metron's fingers danced across holographic interfaces that only he could see, pulling up cosmological maps that showed the multiverse as a vast network of interconnected realities. The source wall breach detected 3 hours ago. This correlates. Something came through from outside drawn by the dimensional instability. Whether by accident or design, I cannot yet determine. The mother box at Highfather's side chimed urgently. Analysis complete. Subject does not exist within Universal Registry. 0 matches across all recorded timelines. Recommendation, immediate intervention required. He's fighting Darkseid's avatar, Highfather said quietly, watching the holographic battle unfold. Even through the degraded image quality, the stranger's skill was evident, each movement precise, economical, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent lifetimes perfecting the art of destruction. If he defeats it, then the true presence will take notice, Metron finished. And if Darkseid perceives this anomaly as either threat or opportunity, he didn't need to complete the thought. Both of them understood the implications of their ancient enemy, gaining access to power from beyond creation's boundaries. Highfather made his decision with the speed of someone who'd commanded during the wars that had shaped the cosmos. Convene the council, all of them, and send word to Earth. The Justice League needs to know what's coming. He paused, studying the figure on the screen as it traded blows with an avatar that could crack planets. He's heading for the inhabited realms. Whether he means to or not, he's bringing chaos with him. The mother box pulsed acknowledgement and began transmitting alerts across the dimensional barriers to Earth-Zero. On Apocalypse, the battle raged, each exchange of force, peeling back another layer of the reality that separated the new God's domain from the mortal world. And the stranger, the anomaly, the impossible warrior from outside, everything they knew, continued to fight with the single-minded intensity of someone who'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. Metron's chair began to fade, taking him back to whatever hidden laboratory he used for his most sensitive research. But before he vanished completely, he spoke one last observation that made even Highfather's ancient confidence waver. I've calculated his power trajectory if he continues to escalate. The numbers. Metron's voice carried a note of something that might have been awe or might have been dread. They don't stop. His potential appears to have no ceiling within measurable parameters. If he reaches his theoretical maximum in our reality, the structural integrity of the local multiverse becomes uncertain. Then he was gone, and Highfather was left alone with the mother boxes and their chorus of warnings, watching a battle that should have been impossible, trying to prepare for consequences that his vast experience couldn't quite predict. The stranger was coming. The cosmic order was fracturing. And somewhere in the spaces between forces that had remained dormant since the first crisis were beginning to stir. The Watchtower's alarm system had 17 different threat classifications, each calibrated to specific types of danger that Earth might face. Alien invasion, dimensional breach, magical incursion, time paradox. Superman had helped design the hierarchy himself, ensuring that the League could respond appropriately to whatever crisis emerged. The system had never activated all 17 categories simultaneously before, until now. Batman stood before the primary monitoring station, his cowl's lenses reflecting the cascade of red warnings that painted his face in crimson light. Behind him, the Justice League assembled in various states of readiness, some teleported directly from missions halfway across the globe, others roused from civilian lives by the unprecedented nature of the alert. Wonder Woman arrived in full armor, her hand already on the lasso at her hip. Flash vibrated with nervous energy, his metabolism burning through anxiety at superhuman speeds. Green Lantern's ring hummed with barely contained power construct formations, flickering in and out of existence around his clenched fist. Superman floated near the central viewport, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone as he studied the data streaming across multiple screens. The numbers made no sense. Energy readings that exceeded anything in their database, moving at speeds that suggested teleportation, but with signatures indicating continuous physical transit. And the trajectory was unmistakable. Whatever was coming had left Apocalypse 3 minutes ago and would reach Earth's atmosphere in less than 2. "Talk to me, Bruce." Superman's voice carried the weight of command, all traces of Clark Kent's Kansas warmth burned away by tactical necessity. Batman's fingers moved across holographic interfaces with practiced efficiency, pulling up analysis from every sensor array within 10 light-years. Single target, humanoid configuration, energy output fluctuating between Kryptonian baseline and something approximately 40% higher. But it's the signature that concerns me. He isolated a waveform pattern that pulsed with violent irregularity across the display. It doesn't match anything in our records. Not apocalypsean technology, not new god energy signatures, not even close to source-derived power. Could it be another Kryptonian? Wonder Woman moved to stand beside Superman, her warrior's instincts reading the tension in his posture. Someone who survived? No. Batman's response was flat certain. Kryptonian biology interacts with our sun in predictable ways. This is something else entirely. The energy operates on principles our instruments barely recognize. He pulled up a secondary screen, showing the devastation on Apocalypse, whole districts reduced to slag parademon forces, scattered like leaves before a hurricane. It fought its way through Darkseid's defenses without slowing down, engaged an avatar directly. The battle generated seismic activity, measurable from New Genesis. Martian Manhunter phased through the wall, rather than using the door, his red eyes glowing with concern. "I've attempted telepathic reconnaissance at maximum range. There's something there, a consciousness, but it's shielded by energy I cannot penetrate. Not mental barriers, physical interference from the power radiating off the target." Flash raised his hand like a student in class, a gesture so incongruous with the tension that it almost broke the moment. "Okay, so worst-case scenario, is this like Doomsday Darkseid himself? Should we be evacuating the planet?" "We don't evacuate." Superman's jaw tightened, and solar energy began to leak from his eyes in thin streams of gold. "We don't know its intentions. Maybe it's lost, maybe it's hostile, maybe it's running from something worse. But Earth is under our protection, and nothing gets through us without answering questions first." Green Lantern's ring chimed its AI, delivering updates directly to his auditory cortex. "Approaching Earth's exosphere now. Speed holding steady at Mach 80. Whatever this thing is, it's not trying to hide." Batman's hands stilled on the controls. "Hal, can you read its power levels?" "Ring says they're still climbing. Not exponentially, but steadily, like." Hal Jordan frowned, trying to find the right comparison. "Like it's warming up. Getting ready for something." The viewport showed Earth's curve, the blue marble that 7 billion people called home, hanging vulnerable against the star-studded void. Somewhere above that thin shell of atmosphere, something that had torn through Apocalypse like tissue paper was descending, and every sensor on the watchtower insisted that what was coming couldn't exist within their understanding of universal physics. "Formation Delta," Batman said, his voice cutting through the mounting tension. "Superman takes point to Wonder Woman, and I provide flanking support. Flash, I need you on rapid response. If this goes wrong, you're our evac protocol for civilian populations. Hal construct barriers at maximum density. John maintain tactical telepathy with the team and keep trying to reach the target's mind. Maybe we can talk before we have to fight. Superman nodded once, decisive. Rules of engagement. Contain first, communicates second, combat as last resort. Batman's cowl turned toward the Kryptonian. But Clark, if it proves hostile and we can't stop it conventionally, you go full power immediately. No holding back, no testing limits. New Genesis sent us a priority alert. Highfather doesn't do that, unless something has him genuinely worried. The unspoken implication hung in the air like static electricity. Highfather commanded gods-led armies that had fought since the universe was young, wielded power that could reshape realities. If something made him worry enough to warn mortals, then the Justice League was facing a threat that might exceed their operational parameters entirely. Wonder Woman drew her sword, the God-Killer blade singing, as it cleared its sheath. Then we meet it as warriors, with honor, with strength, and with Earth at our backs. Her eyes found Superman's. Whatever comes through that sky, it will learn that this world is defended. Flash tried for levity and almost succeeded. No pressure or anything, but I'd really like to not die today. Just putting that out there. The Watchtower's AI spoke in the calm, measured tones of a system designed to function during apocalypses. Target entering upper atmosphere. Impact zone 20 miles north of Metropolis, unpopulated agricultural region. Projected ground contact in 40 seconds. Batman activated the teleportation array coordinates locked to intercept the descending threat before it could reach populated areas. League, move out. We have 30 seconds to set up a perimeter. Whatever this is, whatever it wants, it stops at us. One by one, they disappeared in columns of light, teleporting to the farmland that was about to become a battlefield. Superman went last, pausing for half a heartbeat to look back at the Earth, rotating serenely below. He'd protected this planet from gods, demons, and monsters that defied description. He'd stood against Darkseid himself and survived. But something about the readings on those screens, the way Batman's voice had carried an edge of uncertainty, made his Kryptonian instincts scream warnings his conscious mind couldn't quite articulate. Then he was gone, and the Watchtower hung empty and silent, its instruments tracking the convergence of two forces that were about to collide with consequences that would ripple across the entire DC cosmos. In the sky above Kansas, a purple star began to fall, burning through the atmosphere, with friction that turned the air to plasma. On the ground below, the Justice League assembled in formation. 7 heroes who'd saved the world more times than history recorded, preparing to face something that their sensors insisted shouldn't exist. The star descended. The League held position. And in the seconds before impact, the universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen when the unstoppable force met the immovable defense. Vegeta hit the ground like a meteor, and the farmland ceased to exist. The impact vaporized topsoil for 300 yards in every direction, turning fertile Kansas earth into glass that cooled in radiating patterns of crystalline geometry. Wheat fields caught fire from the thermal bloom, and the shockwave flattened a barn 2 miles away. When the dust cleared the Saiyan, Prince stood at the center of the crater, his purple aura guttering like a dying flame, before stabilizing into steady radiance. He rolled his shoulders once, testing the integrity of a body that had just survived atmospheric entry, without a ship, without armor, without anything except his own biology and will. The Justice League surrounded him in a practiced perimeter, 7 heroes positioned at strategic angles to provide overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. They'd fought together long enough that the formation was instinctive Superman at 12 o'clock, Wonder Woman at 3, Green Lantern at 6, Flash, circling the exterior at speeds that made him a blur, even to enhanced perception. Martian Manhunter hovered above his telepathy, already probing the stranger's defenses. Batman held the 9 o'clock position, his utility belt primed with contingencies for scenarios ranging from alien invasion to demonic incursion. Vegeta looked at them and smiled. Superman spoke first, his voice carrying across the devastated field with the authority of someone who'd negotiated with gods and tyrants. You need to stop. We don't know who you are or what you want, but you've caused enough damage. Stand down and we can talk about this. The Saiyan Prince's response was a laugh, short, harsh, and utterly devoid of humor. Stand down. He tested the words like they were a foreign language, which in a sense they were. His eyes tracked across each hero in turn, assessing, cataloging, finding them all wanting. I don't take orders from weaklings, playing at strength. Flash moved first, unable to help himself, his connection to the Speed Force igniting as he accelerated past Mach 5 in a heartbeat. He'd fought speedsters, raced Superman, vibrated through solid matter. He knew speed in ways that transcended normal physics, understood velocity as a fundamental force of reality. He came at Vegeta from 6 angles simultaneously, his fists striking with force that could shatter steel, creating sonic booms that rolled across the Kansas plains like thunder. Vegeta caught him by the throat without looking. The motion was so fast that even Superman's perception barely registered it at one moment. Flash was a crimson blur of kinetic energy. The next, he was dangling 3 feet off the ground, his eyes wide with shock as fingers like steel cables compressed his windpipe. Vegeta studied the struggling speedster with clinical detachment, feeling the vibrations in the younger man's molecular structure, the way his body tried to phase through the grip and failed. Kai didn't care about molecular phasing. Ki was will made manifest, and Vegeta's will was absolute. He threw Flash at the ground, and the impact created a secondary crater that sent cracks racing through the crystallized soil. The speedster didn't get up immediately, his healing factor already working overtime to repair ribs that had turned to powder on contact with Earth. Green Lantern's construct materialized before Flash's body finished bouncing a massive hammer of emerald energy that carried the weight of Hal Jordan's military discipline and combat experience. The construct accelerated to supersonic velocity powered by willpower so intense it could bend physics, and Vegeta let it hit him square in the chest. For a moment, nothing happened. The hammer pressed against the Saiyan's torso, pushing him back perhaps 3 inches. Emerald light flaring with intensity that would have pulverized a tank. Then Vegeta raised one hand, pressed it against the construct's surface, and the entire formation shattered like glass hit with a sledgehammer. The feedback sent Hal staggering his ring, screaming warnings about energy types outside its classification protocols, and Vegeta was already moving toward him. Wonder Woman intercepted her God-Killer blade singing as it arced toward the stranger's neck with speed that could bisect steel. She was a warrior born trained by the Amazons, blessed by gods, and she put everything into that strike technique perfected over centuries' strength that could match Superman's divine purpose channeled through consecrated metal. The sword connected with Vegeta's forearm, and the resulting clash of energies painted the battlefield in white light. The blade stopped dead, unable to penetrate skin that glowed with purple fire. Diana's eyes widened, her warrior's instincts screaming warnings that her mind struggled to process. She'd fought Ares, traded blows with Doomsday, stood against threats that could end civilizations. Nothing organic should be able to stop the God-Killer with bare flesh. But the man before her wasn't even bleeding, wasn't even scratched. He was smiling again, that same cold expression of someone who'd found exactly the kind of challenge he'd been hoping for. Vegeta's backhand sent her flying 3 miles before she managed to arrest her momentum bracelet, sparking as she deflected trees that exploded into splinters at her passage. By the time she stabilized and prepared to return to the fight, the Saiyan had already engaged the next threat. Martian Manhunter dove from above his Martian density, shifting to diamond-hard rigidity as he attempted a telepathic assault and physical grapple simultaneously. His mind pressed against Vegeta's consciousness like a battering ram, trying to find purchase to establish the psychic connection that would let him understand this stranger's intentions and perhaps convince him to cease hostilities. But touching Vegeta's thoughts was like grabbing a live power line, the key that saturated every cell of the Saiyan's body, created interference that made telepathy not just difficult, but agonizing. John pulled back with a mental cry of pain, and in that moment of distraction, Vegeta struck. The punch caught the Martian in his solar plexus, and the kinetic transfer was catastrophic. John flew backward at a trajectory that would take him clean out of Earth's atmosphere if Superman didn't catch him, his Martian physiology struggling to maintain cohesion in the face of trauma that had scrambled his molecular structure. Batman had been analyzing calculating running scenarios through combat algorithms refined across decades of fighting impossible odds. He'd already noted the patterns the stranger fought with precision that suggested formal training. But his base attributes exceeded anything Batman had contingencies for. Kryptonian-level durability speed that challenged the Flash strength that overpowered Wonder Woman. The utility belt carried options for each attribute individually, but combined. This required a different approach. He didn't get the chance to implement it. Superman hit Vegeta like a freight train wrapped in solar fusion, crossing the distance between them, faster than sound could follow. The collision generated a shockwave that flattened what remained of the surrounding farmland, stripped bark from trees half a mile away, and shattered every window in a town 15 miles distant. The two figures became a blur of motion-trading blows at speeds that made following the fight nearly impossible for anyone without enhanced perception. Vegeta blocked a punch that would have demolished a mountain, his forearm meeting Superman's fist with an impact that cracked both bones. Pain exploded through his nervous system, white-hot and overwhelming, and something in the Saiyan prince's mind shifted gears. This was what he'd been searching for. An opponent who could hurt him. Finally. Ultra Ego activated. The transformation was subtle at first, not the dramatic power-up with accompanying light show that marked Super Saiyan transformations. Instead, Vegeta's aura deepened to a shade of purple that seemed to devour light rather than emit it, and his pupils shifted to a shade somewhere between violet and black. The broken bones in his arm knitted back together instantly. But more than that, they came back stronger, denser, more capable of withstanding the forces he was generating. His power level, which had been holding steady throughout the fight, suddenly spiked upward, with enough intensity that every sensor in the watchtower registered the surge. Superman felt it immediately, that sudden increase in resistance as his next punch connected with Vegeta's jaw. The Saiyan's head snapped back, but when it came forward again, his smile had widened into something that was almost ecstatic. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth, and he wiped it away with one hand, staring at the crimson on his fingers, like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. More. The word came out as a growl, primal and hungry. Show me everything you've got, Kryptonian. Superman's eyes blazed gold as solar energy flooded his system. His Kryptonian biology ramping up to combat parameters he usually reserved for world-ending threats. He moved again faster this time, his fists striking with force measured in megatons, each impact generating light and heat and devastation. Vegeta met him blow for blow, and with each exchange the Saiyan's power grew. Not gradually, explosively feeding off the damage Superman inflicted, converting pain into strength through mechanisms that violated every principle of conservation of energy. The other League members could only watch, recovering from their defeats, as the two titans clashed with intensity that threatened to reduce the entire region to radioactive ash. Wonder Woman struggled to her feet, sword in hand, preparing to rejoin the battle. Green Lantern's ring worked overtime, creating shields to protect nearby towns from the collateral damage. Flash finally managed to stand, ribs healed enough to function, and Batman's mind raced through scenarios that all ended with the same conclusion. They were outmatched. Individually, completely, and perhaps even collectively. The stranger hadn't even transformed into whatever his equivalent of Superman going all out might be, and he was matching the Kryptonian punch for punch while growing stronger by the second. If this continued, if he kept escalating, Vegeta drove an uppercut into Superman's chin that launched him into low orbit, then followed with a velocity that turned the air to plasma in his wake. The two disappeared from view, their battle continuing somewhere above the atmosphere where collateral damage would be limited to whoever was losing. In the silence that followed their departure, the Justice League stood in the ruins of Kansas farmland and confronted a reality that their years of experience had prepared them for. But their egos had always denied they'd just met something they might not be able to stop. The battle had reached the thermosphere when reality began to fold. Superman and Vegeta traded blows in the thin atmosphere where oxygen gave way to vacuum. Each impact releasing energy that ionized particles for miles around and created auroras visible from 3 continents. The Kryptonian fought with everything he had: heat vision that could melt neutron stars, frost breath that approached absolute zero strength, amplified by decades of stored solar radiation. But with each strike that connected with each injury inflicted, Vegeta grew stronger. His Saiyan biology metabolized damage like fuel, and Ultra Ego transformed pain into power with an efficiency that mocked conservation laws. Superman drove his fist through Vegeta's guard and felt ribs crack beneath the blow. The Saiyan coughed blood, grinned, and hit back twice as hard. The exchange sent them both tumbling through the upper atmosphere, trailing plasma. And it was during that moment of separation that both warriors felt it simultaneously. Something was watching. The bleed opened like a wound in space, that crimson expanse between realities peeling back to reveal depths that human eyes couldn't properly process. The tear wasn't large, perhaps 20 feet across, but what emerged carried a presence that made the air itself compress in submission. This wasn't an avatar, wasn't a projection of limited power designed to interact with the physical realm. This was a fragment of the true dark side, a sliver of consciousness from the entity that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional existence, and even that fraction carried enough weight to make Earth's magnetic field shudder. The form that coalesced was humanoid, only in the sense that it chose to be standing 15 feet tall, composed of something that looked like living stone but moved with the fluidity of thought. Omega energy didn't just radiate from its eyes, it leaked from every surface, creating distortions in space-time that made observation difficult and comprehension nearly impossible. When it spoke, the words bypassed ears entirely, imprinted themselves directly onto the listener's consciousness. Anomaly. The voice carried harmonics that suggested vast age and vaster patience. You do not belong within creation's boundaries. Vegeta and Superman floated 30 yards apart, both bloodied, both still charged with combat readiness, but the appearance of this third entity shifted the entire dynamic of the engagement. Superman's tactical mind recognized the threat immediately. Whatever this was, it operated on a scale that made their current battle seem trivial by comparison. His solar absorption ramped into overdrive, his Kryptonian biology preparing for combat that would dwarf anything he'd faced before. Vegeta just smiled wider, his purple aura intensifying until it created its own gravitational distortions. Finally, something that felt dangerous. I don't care about your boundaries. The Saiyan prince's voice carried across the void, without medium to transmit it, Kai serving functions that physics insisted were impossible. You want to fight, get in line. The dark side fragment tilted its head in something that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. The gesture transcended normal emotional expression. Its eyes flared and the Omega effect manifested. Not the beams that Darkseid's avatars typically employed, but something far more fundamental, reality-warping energy that sought to erase Vegeta from existence by rewriting the cosmic equation that allowed him to be. The beams crossed the distance in nanoseconds, moving through space that bent to accommodate their passage, and struck Vegeta's center mass with force calibrated to unmake planets. For exactly 3 seconds, the Saiyan Prince ceased to exist. Superman watched in horror as Vegeta's form simply dissolved atoms, scattering energy, dissipating the fundamental bonds that held his body together, coming undone under the Omega effect's assault. Empty space remained where the warrior had been floating, and for a moment, Clark Kent allowed himself to hope that the threat had been neutralized, that whatever this stranger was, Darkseid had handled what the Justice League couldn't. Then Vegeta reformed, materializing from nothing, his body reconstructing itself, particle by particle through mechanisms that made Superman's Kryptonian biology look simple by comparison. The Saiyan was laughing. Actually laughing as his cells knitted back together, his ki. Having somehow maintained coherence even when his physical form had been temporarily erased. Ultra Ego hadn't just survived the Omega effect. It had fed on it. The transformation completed and Vegeta's power level tripled. His aura exploded outward with enough force to create a visible shockwave, even in near-vacuum purple fire, mixed with something darker, something that carried overtones of destruction so pure, they made Darkseid's Omega energy look restrained by comparison. The Saiyan's muscles expanded his frame, growing denser as his biology adapted to contain forces that were actively trying to tear him apart from the inside. Blood vessels burst beneath his skin, creating patterns of crimson across his torso and arms. But the damage healed almost instantly, his regeneration accelerated by the same principle that was making him stronger. Is that it? Vegeta's voice had changed, carrying resonances that suggested he was tapping into something primal, something that predated technique and training. Is that all you've got, God? The dark side fragment paused, and for the first time in eons, something like genuine interest flickered across its features. This anomaly didn't just resist the Omega effect. It thrived on it. The entity's consciousness, vast as it was found itself, confronted with a variable it couldn't properly calculate. Power that grew through destruction, that converted annihilation into strength, that operated on principles entirely foreign to the source and anti-life alike. Superman moved before conscious thought completed positioning himself between Vegeta and Darkseid, his hands raised in a gesture that was half plea, half command. Both of you stop. This escalates any further, and Earth dies. If you want to fight, take it somewhere else. The Phantom Zone empty space, anywhere but here. Neither combatant acknowledged him. Vegeta launched himself at the dark side fragment with velocity that tore holes in the atmosphere. His fist cocked back, his entire being, focused on the singular purpose of testing himself against something that could actually threaten him. The fragment met him halfway, Omega energy coalescing into solid form, and when they collided, the impact created a pulse of energy that washed across Earth's surface like a wave. In the watchtower, every system went offline simultaneously. On New Genesis, mother boxes screamed warnings in 50 languages. The source wall itself registered the disturbance ancient cracks, spreading infinitesimally wider as forces from outside creation hammered against forces that defined it. Monitors throughout the multiverse turned their attention toward Earth Zero, calculating probability matrices for what would happen if this battle reached its logical conclusion. The mathematics were not encouraging. Superman watched as the two titans exchanged blows that could shatter moons. Each strike generating light shows visible from Mars, and he made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed over years of heroism. He couldn't stop this. Not alone, possibly not at all. But he could buy time, could create opportunities, could ensure that when this fight ended, however it ended, Earth would still exist. He activated his Justice League communicator voice tight with controlled urgency. "Bruce, I need every contingency we have. Magic technology, whatever, can generate a dimensional barrier. We need to contain this before it spreads." A pause as Omega Energy and Ultra Ego Kai collided again, the shockwave buffeting him despite being miles from the impact point. "And contact New Genesis. Tell Highfather we need the source itself if we're going to stop what's coming." Because Superman could see it now, could calculate the trajectory of this escalation with Kryptonian precision. Vegeta would keep growing stronger as long as he took damage. Darkseid would keep escalating until his true form emerged fully from the bleed. And when those two forces reached their peak, when an unstoppable Saiyan met an immovable god, reality itself would be the first casualty. The battle raged on two beings who shouldn't exist within the same cosmos, locked in combat that made Superman's earlier fight look like a sparring match. Purple flames and crimson energy painted the sky in colors that hurt to witness, and somewhere far below, 7 billion people went about their lives unaware that the universe was tearing itself apart just beyond the veil of their perception. Vegeta's body was tearing itself apart. The transformation had pushed past every biological threshold Saiyan physiology was designed to accommodate. His cellular structure vibrated at frequencies that should have reduced him to component atoms held together only by ki so dense it had begun to warp local space-time. Muscle fibers ruptured and regenerated thousands of times per second, each cycle making them stronger, but at a cost that was becoming impossible to sustain. His skeleton had fractured in 17 places, the bones knitting back together with increased density that made them heavier than any organic material had right to be. Blood leaked from his eyes, his ears, the corners of his mouth. Not from weakness, from power that exceeded what flesh and bone could contain. Ultra Ego had always been a double-edged technique, trading damage for strength in an escalating spiral that theoretically had no ceiling. But theory met reality in the structure of cells that could only adapt so far before the fundamental architecture collapsed. Vegeta was approaching that limit, racing toward it with the single-minded intensity of a warrior who'd never learned to quit. And he was winning. The Darkseid fragment reeled from the latest exchange, its stone-like form showing cracks for the first time since its emergence. Omega energy poured from those fissures like blood from wounds, and the entity's consciousness registered something it rarely experienced: concern. This anomaly wasn't just resisting erasure, it was adapting to it, incorporating the Omega effect's reality-warping properties into its own power structure. Each time the fragment attacked, Vegeta absorbed the principles behind the assault and emerged stronger, faster, more fundamentally dangerous. The Saiyan prince pressed his advantage with calculated brutality, his fists hammering into the fragment's torso with impacts that sent shockwaves rippling through the bleed itself. He'd stopped thinking in terms of technique. This had devolved into something more primal. A contest of pure force, where the fighter willing to push hardest would claim victory. His aura had turned black at its core, purple flames dancing around edges of darkness, so deep they seemed to consume photons. When his strikes landed, they left after images burned into reality scars in space-time that would take centuries to fully heal. The bleed convulsed around them, that crimson expanse, responding to forces it wasn't designed to accommodate. Monitors across the multiverse watched their instruments redline as readings climbed past theoretical maximums. On New Genesis, Highfather gripped his staff with enough force to crack the ancient wood, feeling the cosmic balance tipping towards something unprecedented. The source wall groaned an impossibility given that it was a structure beyond sound, beyond normal physics, but grown. It did stress fractures spreading across its surface like frost patterns on glass. Superman had retreated to low orbit, maintaining position despite every instinct screaming at him to intervene. Batman's voice crackled through the communicator, feeding him data that confirmed what his Kryptonian senses already knew. They were watching something that might genuinely break reality. Every strike between Vegeta and Darkseid generated energy signatures equivalent to supernovas, and the dimensional barriers separating Earth-Zero from neighboring realities were beginning to show strain. "Clark, you need to evacuate." Wonder Woman's voice joined the channel transmitted from the watchtower where she'd assembled with the remaining League members. "If this continues for another 3 minutes, the bleed destabilizes. After 5, we're looking at potential multiversal collapse." Superman didn't respond immediately, his attention fixed on the battle unfolding above him. He'd fought beside Vegeta briefly, felt the Saiyan's power firsthand. But this was something beyond anything he'd imagined possible. The warrior moved with precision, despite his body falling apart. Each strike placed with surgical accuracy, even as his nervous system operated beyond normal biological tolerances. It was the performance of someone who'd spent a lifetime pushing past every limitation, who'd made transcendence through suffering into an art form. And it was killing him. Vegeta coughed, and blood sprayed into vacuum in a crystalline mist that froze instantly. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel peripheral awareness sacrificed to maintain combat effectiveness. His heart rate had exceeded what should cause immediate cardiac failure, chambers contracting so rapidly they created a continuous tone rather than discrete beats. The pain was extraordinary, overwhelming, a symphony of agony that sang through every nerve ending. Ultra Ego transformed it into power, but the conversion rate was approaching its limit. Soon, very soon, the damage would exceed his ability to heal, and his body would simply cease. He didn't care. This was what he'd trained for, what every moment of his life had been building toward. A battle at the edge of possibility against an opponent who could actually threaten him. Not Goku, not Jiren, not the gods of destruction he'd sparred with during his training. This was something genuinely dangerous. Something that made his Saiyan instincts roar with approval, even as his biology screamed for mercy he would never grant. The Darkseid fragment made its calculation with the speed of thought. This anomaly had exceeded projections, adapted in ways that the true form's consciousness found both fascinating and problematic. Allowing the battle to continue would provide valuable data about power systems outside creation's framework, but it would also risk destabilization on a scale that could affect apocalypse itself. The equation was simple: knowledge versus stability, curiosity versus pragmatism. Darkseid chose pragmatism. The fragment didn't retreat so much as cease to be its form, dissolving back into the bleed as the true presence withdrew its attention. Not surrender, strategic repositioning. The anomaly was too volatile in its current state, too unpredictable. Better to observe, to analyze, to wait until the creature either burned itself out or achieved full adaptation to this reality's laws. Either outcome would provide opportunities. Vegeta hung in space, his aura guttering like a candle flame in wind, and felt his opponent disappear. For 3 seconds, his mind couldn't process what had happened. Victory. No, the fragment had withdrawn, recognizing that continuing the battle served no purpose. Not defeat, but acknowledgement. The god had seen his power and chosen to retreat. The Saiyan prince threw back his head and laughed, the sound carrying no humor. Only the manic satisfaction of someone who'd pushed past every boundary and found himself still standing. Blood droplets scattered from the motion-painting orbits around his floating form, and his body began the process of collapsing in earnest. Superman moved on instinct, closing the distance in milliseconds, catching Vegeta as the transformation finally failed. Ultra Ego couldn't sustain itself when there was no more opponent to fight, no more damage to convert. The purple flames extinguished, and what remained was a warrior whose body had been pushed so far past its operational limits that staying conscious was an achievement measured in seconds. Vegeta's eyes focused on Superman with difficulty recognition, flickering across features distorted by swelling and trauma. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, damaged vocal cords struggling to form words. Not done. Tell that god. I'll find him again. Then consciousness fled, and Superman was left holding an unconscious warrior who'd just fought the true dark side to a standstill, whose power had literally shaken the foundations of the multiverse, and who even now, broken and barely alive, carried enough residual energy to make the Kryptonians' danger sense pulse warnings. In the Watchtower, Batman coordinated evacuation protocols, while simultaneously trying to calculate what they were supposed to do, with a being who'd proven capable of threatening reality itself through sheer combat ability. On New Genesis, Highfather ordered the Mother Boxes to maintain constant surveillance on Earth-Zero, knowing that this incident was merely a prelude to something larger. And in the dark spaces beyond the bleed, in the sphere of gods where the true dark side existed in his most complete form, ancient consciousness turned its full attention toward the anomaly and began planning. The battle had ended. The war had just begun. Superman never made it back to Earth. The collapse started in Vegeta's cells where Ultra Ego had pushed biology past the point of coherent structure. His unconscious body convulsed once in Superman's arms, and the Kryptonian felt the energy signature spike with intensity that made every previous reading look tame by comparison. This wasn't escalation. This was detonation. The Scion's ki, saturated with damage beyond what any healing factor could process, began converting his entire cellular mass into pure destructive force. There was no time to react, no moment to teleport away or activate containment protocols. Vegeta's form blazed with light that existed outside the visible spectrum colors that human eyes would never evolve to perceive, and then he simply stopped being matter. The transformation was instantaneous, flesh and bone and blood, becoming energy so volatile that its mere presence in this dimensional space created cascading failures in the fabric of the bleed. Superman tried to contain it, his Kryptonian biology absorbing radiation that would have sterilized a solar system. For perhaps 2 seconds he held the expanding wave through sheer force of will, his cells converting solar power into a living shield that pushed back against annihilation itself. Then the wave exceeded his capacity to absorb, and Clark Kent ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, his atoms scattered across probability spaces that no longer connected to baseline reality. The explosion propagated through the bleed like infection through a bloodstream. Dimensional barriers that had stood since creation's first moments shattered under the assault, and realities began bleeding into each other with catastrophic results. Earth-Zero felt at first a wave of non-existence that swept across the planet's surface, erasing cities, oceans, and continents in a tide that moved faster than light. 7 billion people had perhaps a millisecond to register confusion. Before they were unmade, their molecules disassembled and scattered across collapsing probability matrices. The Justice League died at their posts. Batman's last thought was a calculation about how they might have prevented this. Wonder Woman gripped her sword and prayed to gods who were already being erased. Flash tried to outrun oblivion and found that speed meant nothing when the track itself was disappearing. They flickered out like candles in a hurricane gone before they could truly comprehend what was ending. New Genesis lasted 14 seconds longer, its divine architecture buying precious moments before the wave consumed it. Highfather used those seconds to broadcast a final warning across the surviving multiverse, his voice carrying across dimensional channels that were already collapsing. The anomaly has breached containment. Full multiversal failure imminent. May the source forgive. The transmission cut as New Genesis joined the void. Apocalypse followed despite Darkseid's attempts to seal his realm from the cascade. The true form watched from the sphere of gods as his empire of millennia was reduced to quantum uncertainty, and for the first time in his existence, the god of tyranny felt something that might have been fear. He tried to withdraw deeper into the abstract planes where he truly lived. But the collapse was accelerating, eating through layers of reality faster than even divine consciousness could retreat. The monitors gathered at the edge of what remained their instruments, useless, their purpose obsolete. They'd been created to observe and maintain the multiverse. Now they watched it die, 52 universes imploding like dying stars as the wave from Vegeta's critical failure rippled through the fundamental structure of creation. Some tried to flee into the dark multiverse, only to find those nightmare realms were collapsing too. Others simply accepted the inevitable, their vast intellects finally encountering a problem that calculation couldn't solve. The source wall cracked completely, and what lay beyond the chaos that preceded existence, the raw unreality that creation had been built to contain, came flooding through. It met the expanding wave of ultra-ego energy, two incompatible forms of absolute destruction, and where they touched, even the concept of space ceased to have meaning. In the last microseconds before awareness itself became impossible, Vegeta's consciousness flickered briefly. Some fragment of the Saiyan Prince existing in the spaces between collapsing dimensions felt what he'd done. Felt the weight of universes ending, of realities unmade of his pride, and battle lust having consumed literally everything. The sensation was too vast for emotion, too absolute for regret. Then that awareness too was gone, and the multiverse that had contained Darkseid and Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman heroes and villains across infinite variations simply stopped being, replaced by nothing, not void, not emptiness, but the complete absence of anything that could be said to exist. In a cosmos that had never known this particular arrangement of matter and energy, that had never hosted this specific combination of narratives and possibilities, silence reigned absolute. No observers remained to mark the passing. No records survived to remember what had been. The Saiyan Prince had sought a battle at the edge of possibility. He'd found it. And in finding it, he'd ended everything. Vegeta's eyes opened in Superman's arms, and clarity returned like a lightning strike. The Saiyan Prince felt the energy building inside him, felt ultra-ego pushing toward the critical threshold, where his body would convert entirely to destructive force. His cells vibrated on the edge of detonation. Ki saturated past any sustainable level, and for 3 heartbeats, he teetered on the precipice of becoming the weapon that would end everything. The path forward was clear: lose control, detonate cascade failure across the multiverse. Simple, inevitable. He refused. The act of will required to pull back from that edge was greater than any feat of strength he'd ever accomplished. Ultra-ego screamed for release, for the final transformation that would cement his power at the cost of existence itself. But Vegeta had spent his entire life mastering control, channeling the savage instincts of Saiyan biology through discipline that most warriors couldn't comprehend. He was a prince heir to a warrior race, and princes did not lose control like common berserkers. The energy folded inward, compressed by force of will, into stable configurations that his biology could barely contain. His aura shifted from chaotic black-purple detonation to controlled violet flame, and the immediate crisis passed. Damage remained. His body was still breaking down, still operating beyond sustainable parameters, but the countdown to apocalypse had stopped. Superman felt the change instantly, his Kryptonian senses detecting the shift from imminent explosion to something resembling stability. How did you... Quiet. Vegeta's voice was rough damaged, but carried undeniable command. He pushed himself out of Superman's grip, floating under his own power despite every cell screaming protest. His vision swam, forcing him to blink away blood, and when he looked at Earth, rotating below, something clicked in his combat-focused mind. This wasn't just a battle. This had never been just a battle. The dark side fragment hadn't retreated from fear. It had withdrawn because the fight served no purpose. Because from the gods' perspective, this was data collection, not genuine conflict. Vegeta was an anomaly to be studied, a variable to be analyzed, another piece on a cosmic board where beings like Darkseid and Highfather played games that spanned epochs. The realization carried a bitter taste familiar from his days serving Frieza, being used as a tool by beings who saw him as disposable. "Your gods," Vegeta said, turning to face Superman fully. "They control everything here. The source, the anti-life, all of it just tools to maintain their power structure." Superman's expression was guarded, his tactical mind trying to determine if this was another threat. The new gods maintain cosmic balance. Without them, you'd be free. The Saiyan prince's smile was sharp bitter. "I know tyranny, Kryptonian. Spent my life under Frieza's boot, thought I was serving a purpose. Took me decades to see the chains for what they were." He looked past Superman toward the bleed where the dark side fragment had vanished. "Your universe operates the same way. Gods at the top, mortals at the bottom, and everyone convinced it's the natural order." The accusation hung in space between them. Superman wanted to argue to defend the cosmic structure that had existed since creation's dawn. But something in Vegeta's words resonated with experiences Clark Kent had spent years trying to rationalize. The times Darkseid had threatened Earth while the Source remained silent. The occasions when divine intervention came too late or not at all, or came with prices that felt like extortion. Vegeta didn't wait for a response. His Kai flared, unstable, but directed, and he moved not toward Earth, not toward empty space, but toward the bleed itself. His aura carved through dimensional barriers like a cutting torch through paper. And Superman could only watch as the Saiyan prince tore a path into the space between realities. The bleed resisted that crimson expanse, trying to reject the foreign energy. But Vegeta had absorbed enough Omega effect during his battle to understand how this realm operated. He pushed deeper, following the connections that linked Apocalypse to New Genesis, that bound the Source Wall to the divine hierarchies that claimed dominion over 52 universes. His hands blazed with violet fire as he reached points where dimensional anchors existed, the metaphysical structures that maintained God rule over mortal realms. And he began to break them. Each anchor that shattered sent shockwaves through the cosmic order. In the sphere of gods, Darkseid felt his connection to Apocalypse flicker. On New Genesis, mother boxes screamed warnings as the source frequency distorted. The structures weren't destroyed. Vegeta lacked the sustained power for that, but they were damaged, destabilized, made vulnerable in ways they'd never been before. The cracks he created would spread, would weaken the absolute authority that divine beings had wielded since time began. Superman tried to stop him, closing the distance with Kryptonian speed. But Vegeta had already accomplished his goal. The Saiyan prince hung in the bleed, his body finally reaching its absolute limit, and met Superman's eyes with grim satisfaction. "You're free now, all of you. Your gods can still act, still influence, but their control is broken. What you do with that?" Vegeta coughed, blood crystallizing in the vacuum. "That's your choice." The dimensional fabric behind him tore wider. But this rift wasn't collapsing, it was opening a wound that led elsewhere. Back toward the energy signature that matched his ki, toward the reality where Saiyan warriors and destroyer gods followed different rules. Vegeta had been pulled here by accident, by resonance between damaged barriers and his own power. Now he was using that same principle to forge a path home. "Wait." Superman's hand extended an unconscious gesture that surprised them both. "You're dying. Let me help. I don't need help from those who accept chains." But Vegeta's expression softened minutely, the barest acknowledgement of respect earned through combat. "You're strong Kryptonian, stronger than you've shown. Stop pulling your punches. Stop letting gods decide your limits." A pause, wheezing breath. "And tell that tyrant I'll be back. Next time I'm coming for his true form." The rift swallowed him before Superman could respond. Dimensional energies closing around the Saiyan prince, like a closing fist. For a moment, Vegeta's purple aura was visible through the gap, defiant and unbroken, despite a body that should have failed hours ago. Then the bleed sealed itself, and he was gone. Superman floated alone in the space between realities, processing what had just occurred. On Earth below, Batman's voice crackled through the communicator demanding status updates. On New Genesis, emergency councils convened, as Highfather tried to understand what damage had been done to structures that had stood since creation. And in the sphere of gods, Darkseid's true consciousness focused fully on the anomaly that had just shattered divine monopolies and vanished into the multiverse. The Saiyan prince was gone. But the cracks he'd left behind would take centuries to repair, and in those cracks, the beings of the DC universe would find unprecedented freedom to forge their own paths without absolute divine oversight. Whether they used that freedom wisely remained to be seen. Clark Kent looked at Earth, at the civilization he'd sworn to protect, and for the first time in years, wondered if he'd been protecting them from the wrong threats. The question felt dangerous, revolutionary, like something that would have consequences he couldn't predict. Good, a voice in his head whispered, maybe his own. Maybe an echo of the warrior who'd just challenged everything Superman thought he knew. Gods should be questioned. Authority should be challenged. And power, true power, came from choosing your own path, rather than following one laid out by beings who claimed to know better. He began his descent back to Earth, leaving the bleed behind, carrying with him the weight of revelation and the promise of change. The Justice League convened in the Watchtower 3 days after the Saiyan prince disappeared. And the silence in the room carried more weight than any briefing Batman had ever delivered. Superman stood before the central viewport, his cape motionless in the station's artificial gravity, watching Earth rotate with the steady patience of geological time. He hadn't spoken much since returning from the bleed, his usual optimism tempered by questions that didn't have comfortable answers. Wonder Woman stood at his right, her god-killer blade sheathed, but her hand never far from its hilt, while the rest of the League occupied their stations with the quiet tension of soldiers processing a battle that had ended without clear victory or defeat. Batman broke the silence with characteristic directness. Analysis is complete. The dimensional anchors linking the source to mortal realms sustained 47% structural damage. Repairs are theoretically possible, but the mother boxes estimate centuries of work. Highfather has confirmed that divine influence over Earth Zero has been Reduced. Reduced? Flash tested the word like it might explode. So what does that mean for us? Are the new gods just gone now? They can still act, Martian Manhunter said quietly, his red eyes reflecting data streams only he could see. But their authority is no longer absolute. The stranger's assault created fractures in the cosmic hierarchy. Where once the gods could command, now they must persuade. Green Lantern's ring pulsed with residual data it had collected during the battle energy signatures it still couldn't fully classify. The Corps wants a full report. Guardians are concerned. Something from outside the emotional spectrum came into our universe, fought the new gods to a standstill, and left. They want to know if it's coming back. As Superman finally turned from the viewport, and his expression carried a complexity that Clark Kent rarely showed. He said he would. Next time for Darkseid's true form. A pause considering. And I believe him. Should we be preparing? Wonder Woman's warrior instincts demanded concrete action, strategic planning. Fortifying defenses, seeking allies. No. Superman's interruption was gentle, but absolute. He didn't come here to conquer. He came because the universe pulled him through a breach he didn't create. And when he left, the Kryptonian struggled to articulate what he'd felt in those final moments. He wasn't our enemy. He was someone who saw tyranny and refused to accept it. Even divine tyranny. Batman's cowl tilted slightly, the gesture conveying volumes about his own thoughts on authority and chains. The question becomes, was he right? No one answered immediately. The implications were too vast, too dangerous to voice casually. For decades, the Justice League had operated under the assumption that cosmic hierarchy was necessary, that beings like Highfather and the Source provided essential structure. The Saiyan Prince had challenged that assumption with his fists and emerged victorious enough to make them reconsider. On New Genesis, Highfather stood before the damaged anchors, his staff resting against crystalline structures that flickered with unstable energy. The mother boxes sang dirges mourning the loss of absolute certainty, and around him, the new gods gathered to witness what their leader would decree. We rebuild, Highfather said, finally his voice carrying the weight of epics. But not as we were. The anomaly showed us that power maintained through control breeds only resentment. When he returns, if he returns, let him find us changed. Let him find gods who serve rather than rule. Metron's Mobius chair hummed with calculation. A paradigm shift of this magnitude will take millennia to fully implement. Then we begin now. Highfather's grip on his staff tightened. Before another warrior from beyond decides our time is finished. In the sphere of gods where reality bent to will and thought became law, the true Darkseid contemplated the anomaly with something approaching fascination. His projection had been forced to retreat, not defeated, but strategically withdrawn from a battle that served no immediate purpose. The Saiyan Prince had proven himself worthy of genuine attention, a variable that existed outside all equations Darkseid had spent eons perfecting. The god of tyranny smiled an expression that would have terrified mortal observers. Let the warrior return. Let him bring his impossible power and his refusal to submit. Darkseid had existed since the universe learned to die, had outlasted countless threats, had perfected domination across infinite variations. One more challenge, however unprecedented, was merely another opportunity to prove absolute superiority. But even as that confidence settled into his cosmic consciousness, Darkseid found himself reviewing the battle data with unusual care, analyzing the mechanics of Ultra Ego, calculating strategies for when, not if, when the Saiyan Prince made good on his promise. The god who claimed to know all ends found himself uncertain about this one, and that uncertainty carried its own dark appeal. Across dimensional barriers, in a universe where Saiyans pushed past gods and warriors, achieved the impossible through stubborn will, Vegeta materialized in the training grounds where his journey had begun. His body was a roadmap of damaged bones, fractured and imperfectly healed muscles torn and regenerated. Cellular structure pushed past every safe limit. He collapsed immediately, consciousness finally surrendering to biology's demands. Bulma found him 3 hours later, unconscious and broken, but undeniably alive, and her scream brought the Z-fighters running. They gathered around the Saiyan Prince, this warrior who disappeared without explanation, and returned in worse condition than any of them had seen since the Majin Buu era. Goku crouched beside his rival fingers, checking for a pulse, finding one that beat with stubborn irregularity. "Where did you go?" Goku's voice carried genuine concern beneath its trademark simplicity. Vegeta's eyes cracked open, focusing with difficulty on Kakarot's worried face. His lips moved, forming words that took 3 attempts to vocalize. "Fought a god. Real one. Not the destroyers we know." A wheezing laugh. "Broke his throne. He'll remember me." Then he passed out again, and Goku was left holding his rival, while Bulma organized medical transport, wondering what kind of battle could reduce Vegeta to this state while still putting that particular satisfied smile on his face. In the following months, as Vegeta recovered and Goku pestered him for details, he refused to provide. The Saiyan Prince would occasionally pause during training and look at the sky with an expression that mixed anticipation with something darker. He'd touched another cosmos, shaken its foundations, and left his mark on divine hierarchies that had stood since creation. The battle hadn't ended, not really. It had merely been postponed, both sides regrouping for a confrontation that would dwarf their first encounter. Somewhere in the space between universes where the bleed touched the chaotic void that separated Dragon Ball from DC, the barriers were thinner now. Damaged by Vegeta's passage, weakened by the strain of containing Ultra Ego at its peak. It would be easier to cross next time. Easier for Vegeta to return. Easier for Darkseid to follow. The Saiyan Prince resumed his training with renewed intensity, pushing toward limits beyond even what he'd achieved in that other cosmos. Ultra Ego had peaked, but peaks could be transcended. Gods could be challenged. Thrones could be shattered. And when he was ready, when his body had healed and his power had grown, and the barriers between universes thinned enough, Vegeta would keep his promise. He would return to that universe of capes and gods. Find the tyrant who'd retreated from their battle and finish what they'd started. The Prince of all Saiyans had found a challenge worthy of his pride. Nothing would stop him from claiming it. Not distance, not dimension, not gods, nothing.